I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, Minnesota's farms produce more than just crops, livestock, and other agricultural products. They also produce big numbers for our economy.
Food deserts are a big issue. We have places where getting to food is a challenge. In-home producers can have a pretty huge impact.
Turkey lasers are awesome. It scares away the waterfowl, who are the sort of patient zero when it comes to avian influenza. 99.9% effective in deterring bird flu.
The new laws and technology the Senate is supporting to advance agriculture. Plus,
Brady's death was preventable. Tragically, less than 2 years later, another family experienced a similar devastating loss.
Let's not let this situation happen again.
the bill that aims to save lives by creating new protections for workers using scuba gear to remove lake weeds is heard on the floor. We'll tell you where it stands now. And the Senate's omnibus bills are moving out of their committees, where you can find them to see which priorities are being funded. That's all coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
Spring has sprung, and here in Minnesota, aside from May flowers, it also means farmers markets will start popping up, allowing shoppers to support local farm-to-fork businesses. These producers may be small scale, but they help prevent food deserts in their communities and stimulate the economy. With me now is Republican Senator Bill Lieske, who says these small businesses can have a big impact, and he aims to give them more opportunities to do just that. Senator, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you have a bill that impacts Minnesota's cottage food producers. Let's start at the beginning. What are cottage foods and who produces them?
Okay, so cottage foods is very similar to what it sounds like. Granted, I don't think it's made in a cottage anymore, but most of the time it is in-home producers that produce foods, baked goods mostly, that are very specific to some regulations that we have in place, but they're very safe foods in the regards of those regulations. And so who produces them? Just pretty much anybody. A lot of people are looking for a secondary income, or they're staying at home with their kids. A lot of stay-at-home moms participate, things like that.
Okay, so like our neighbors could be.
You might be surprised how many people would be in the cottage foods industry. Yeah.
All right, Senator, how much of an impact do these cottage food producers or that industry have on our larger economy?
They can have a pretty huge impact. You know, during the committee hearings and things like that, we heard about what types of things that they do impact. And in this case, like you were talking about here at the intro, is that food deserts are a big issue. We have places where getting to food is a challenge. And so these individuals happen to be at a farmer's market. So things like that.
Senator, this seems to be somewhat of a unique industry, smaller, of course, because it's the cottage foods, small-scale producers. So how did this issue catch your attention?
So it's kind of funny you ask, but it happens to be because of my neighbors. So I happen to live in a very small town. R-Lonsdale, Minnesota is where I live. I happen to be the chiropractor there, and a few of my patients and actually neighbors happen to be cottage foods producers, and I had no idea what it was about. Before I ran for office, I just had their cakes or their specialty treats, and so I just happened to know about what they had. And when I became a senator, they said, "Hey, by the way, there's these weird limits on how much we can make or things like that, and can you look into this and can you maybe write a bill to change that?" So I didn't know the venture that I was going to be starting on in 2023 when I wrote a bill just to change that base price of how much they could make.
It's really neat to know the kind of impact you can have as a senator and how accessible you are to neighbors, community members. So that's really wonderful that they were able to reach you that way and have an impact that could be statewide. Speaking of, your bill, Senate File 391, aims to amend the state's current cottage food laws, which are called the Pickle Bill.
Originally.
So what are those current laws? Take me through the Pickle Bill, and what does your bill hope to change?
So the history of it is something that I ended up diving into, not knowing by introducing this bill that I was going to get introduced to all this history. I believe way back in the early 2000s is when the Pickle Bill originated. I think it's 2005, can't remember the exact date. It's either 2003 or 2005. Of course, the cottage foods industry people would be disappointed that I can't give you the exact date. But That's when it started, and it had a very low cap on it. I think it was $18,000 is all they were allowed to earn. So then fast forward into the early 2010s, they started pushing for higher caps, and that got up to the point where they're at, I think in 2021, which was the $78,000. Then my bill, introduced in 2023, the first version of this update, was to move it to $85,000. Unfortunately, we just didn't quite get there. And it just kind of fizzled out, and we had some changes, but not very many. The big thing was shipping was another part of the discussion that they wanted, because it allows them to get to places, again, even more food desert-like. I talked to a gentleman from Grand Rapids, actually, of all places, and he does freeze-dried foods, and he wanted to be able to have his business be able to get across that area of northern Minnesota. It's a very hard area. You can't just simply drive and drop it off. Right now, that's the state law is that you have to drop it off. You have to be the end producer and the person who delivers it to the end user. And so he's excited to see that ability, because his business can then grow and function really well. So that's kind of the basics of where it was and how it's going.
Thank you, Senator. During the committee hearing for this bill, a representative from the Legislation Institute for Justice testified on behalf of your bill, and they said it improves economic liberty in the state. What does that mean? So
economic liberty means it's another way for somebody to earn money, and it gives them the right to do that without having to go through all of the heavy, burdensome red tape, as we like to call it. The one important thing about cottage foods that's different than most commercial industry food-related issues is there's not a huge commercial kitchen requirement. There's no commercial licensing requirements. This is actually an exemption, as Senator Putnam would be very keen to point out, is this is an exemption, not a license. And so that's the really big difference here, and that's where I think she was talking about economic liberty.
Okay. During that hearing, there were some concerns brought up about food safety and holding these small-scale, home-based food producers accountable. How do you respond to those kinds of concerns?
So, whilst those are big concerns and valid, I do worry about food safety as well. Working as a healthcare provider myself, and being in the industry of healthcare, and actually in my undergrad I spent a lot of time in an emerging diseases lab, learning about how microbiology can cause some pretty significant problems. The difference is when you cook at home, and these products that they produce have to have a specific acidic level, they have to have a specific water value. In fact, they need to be pretty dry, and they have hydrometers, so they're testing all these things in order to sell them under the cottage foods exemption. So they have to follow a very strict guideline in order to sell those things. It's not just like, hey, I'm going to make this product and go sell it, and there's no questions. There are very strict guidelines as to what they can sell. And so that's why I don't think that the safety is much in question. They link it back to there's not very many complaints related to the food side.
Okay. Now, Senator, there's a lot going on nationally, internationally, in regards to agricultural products and where they are not going. So are we primed for this to be a really good, unique moment for cottage food producers?
Absolutely. So that's a good question. And I would ask questions in return is, obviously with the uncertainty, we don't know where it's going. So there's obviously that question. But the question then is, can this fill in that gap? We're not going to be importing foods if that's the case. If we're not going to be importing foods due to tariffs or things of that nature, then maybe this is a good opportunity for those individuals, A, to start their business and then grow the business to a point where they are using a commercial kitchen. So it's a very good launching pad for these small businesses.
Now, your bill was successful in committee and it was added to the omnibus bill. So if it becomes law, if it goes through the rest of the process, how soon can we get our favorite cottage foods shipped to our homes?
So as far as I can tell, I believe it is going to be an August 1st start date, if I remember right from the original bill. Of course, that could change anytime. Those omnibus bills get a little goofy sometimes with conference committees and things. So the exact date, I'm not entirely certain, but I believe August 1st is the goal.
Fantastic. Love that. Okay. Senator, any final thoughts?
I don't think so, other than I appreciate your time, and I look forward to the food freedom that's coming with cottage foods.
I do too. All right. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
It's not every day that we have the opportunity to pass a bill that will save the lives of Minnesotans, but today is one of those days.
That day, senators heard Senate File 1346 on the floor. The bill aims to protect Minnesotans' lives by improving worker safety when it comes to lake weed removal using scuba gear.
He expected it to be a fun summer job, a way to be outdoors and earn some money, but he was not provided any formal training on how to use the scuba gear when he was sent into the water on day one. He was just 20 years old, and he had been on the job with dive guys for 3 days when he drowned in Lake Minnetonka.
When introducing the bill, its chief author, DFL Senator Liz Bolden, shared Brady Ani's story. Less than 2 years after Brady's death, 18-year-old Joseph Anderson died under similar conditions. Senator Bolden says those deaths were preventable, and her bill, the Brady Ani and Joseph Anderson Safety Act, or Senate File 1346, ensures they won't happen again.
So the bill we have before us today closes the gaps that led to Brady and Joseph's deaths. It requires that anyone using scuba gear to perform aquatic plant management to use specific equipment. It requires that those using scuba gear to do this work hold at least an open water scuba diving certification. It requires the use of a standby diver and CPR training. It also adds worker safety requirements to the DNR permitting process for aquatic plant management.
Oftentimes, the legislation that we consider, the laws that we pass, have to do with keeping people safe, protecting lives, and ensuring sometimes that tragedies that have occurred don't occur again in the future. That's the law we have before us, plain and simple.
After some debate, the bill passed in a 54-10 vote. Because of a technical amendment, it now goes back to the House before it can be sent to Governor Walz's desk. If you have ideas or questions about legislation or concerns that it can address, our next guest is listening. This senator made listening sessions a focus of his this session, saying your feedback helps create policies that can better serve your community and the state as a whole. With me now is DFL Senator Aric Putnam. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
Thanks for having me here. Good to get a chance to visit.
Absolutely. So, Senator, how many listening sessions did you hold? And did you find there was a kind of appetite for this type of interaction?
I think there always is. I mean, we see a lot of people who are frustrated with politics, and I think that frustration comes from a lack of reciprocal communication. So there's not enough engagement either way. So it's not just about the policies for me, it's also about the relationships that you build up in these contexts. So I've held probably close to 40 listening sessions in town halls in the last couple of years. And in the last session, last couple months, I think we're probably at 4 or 5. And the thing that's most important to me about these sessions is that I get chances to actually meet and talk to people in the district. It's not just about the issues, it's that now they know that I'm the person they can yell at if they want to. And that's an important part of how this was supposed to work.
Well, let's hope they're not yelling too much. But speaking of a recent listening session you did, you were just in St. Cloud listening to veterans. So what were you listening for, and what did they tell you?
Well, so that's a new jurisdiction for me. I'm from a military family. Veterans have always been incredibly important to me. But it's a new professional responsibility for me. And I think it's really important when we get into new jurisdictions or places where you're making decisions that can have an impact on a population, that you actually sit down with that population. When I first became chair of agriculture, within 2 weeks, we had a listening session up in Pierce, Minnesota, with over 300 farmers in it. So I think that's just a basic thing in terms of good governance and making good policy. And so we had probably about 50 veterans show up at the library in St. Cloud to give us a chance to talk about the things that they cared about. But again, also for me to get a chance to get to know them and for them to get to know me.
Now, it was said that veterans' issues were a key priority for the 2025 legislative session, and your committee expanded to oversee that. As you mentioned, it was new for you. And in fact, you guys created a dedicated subcommittee for veterans. So why was it such a focus this session?
Well, it's really important that it has its own dedicated resources and that we're conscious of the fact that veterans' issues are as important as issues in health and human services or in the jobs and economic development sphere. So calling it a subcommittee was a way of making sure it would have its own budget target. And its own topics. And something that was really important to me that hadn't been done in prior years is I never bled the agenda one over into the other. So if we're having a Veterans Day, we're having a Veterans Day. We're having an Ag Day, we're having an Ag Day. I didn't just kind of like squish things in together because I think it's important that both those jurisdictions understand that they are worthy of our time, dedication, and respect. So you got to keep it as distinct as possible just to make sure that that's clear.
And aside from creating this new dedicated subcommittee, what else happened in that sphere this session? What would you consider the accomplishments when it comes to veterans issues?
Well, we had a pretty significant investment in vets' homes. One of the things that people don't realize, a couple years ago, during the span of time where we had a surplus, we put a ton of money, a ton of that surplus went into building 3 new veterans' homes, which was a great, wonderful accomplishment for 2 years ago that I'm really proud of. But the challenge was that we don't have enough infrastructure or people working in those veterans homes so that they can really maximize the good that they can do. So we're putting a significant amount of money into the vets homes to make sure that people who need a place to be can be taken care of. So in terms of budget, that's one of our big focuses. But in terms of policy, something I'm really excited about, and a little bit angry too, and I don't get angry, but I'm a little bit angry about too, is we have people out there who will profit off of veterans' benefits claims. They'll take a chunk of the benefits that veteran earned, that veteran deserves, for filling out a form for him. Not for advocating for him, just filling out a form for him. Sometimes they don't even do that. And they still will take 5 times what that benefit increase was for that veteran. And they'll let the veteran finance that fee too, which is just incorrigible to me. So they're called claim sharks. And so we have legislation this session that's going to make those folks actually get accredited so that there's some sense of accountability. What they're doing right now is technically illegal in the federal context, but there's no accountability. So some states around the country are creating this requirement to become accredited so that we have ways to find the bad apples and prune them so that they don't keep taking advantage of veterans. So that's something that's happened in the Veterans Committee, but I'm also pretty proud of it just more generally because it's pretty basic stand-up stuff to do.
Now, you mentioned stuff that happens nationally, and earlier this session you had a hearing or a listening session on the impacts of federal actions on Minnesota's farmers and its ag community. So what are those federal actions you were referring to, and what were your big takeaways from that hearing?
The first thing I think that's got to be perfectly clear is a lot of apologists for the current regime will say things like, well, he hasn't actually done anything yet, he's just making lots of noise. Noise can be impactful too. And the chaos that is tangible and empirical that we're suffering right now is its own harm. So we're not really sure the kinds of budgetary decisions that we can make because we have no idea what the federal government's going to do. They say they're going to do one thing one week and something else the next. And it has had some pretty significant consequences on agriculture. We've already lost $1.4 billion in soybean futures values. Our friends who farm soybeans know perfectly well what happened to them in 2018 with the tariffs on China in particular. I mean, it's one of those things where these tariffs are great for Brazil, but they're horrible for Minnesota. So Brazil now has a really functional, thriving soybean market because of the tariffs in 2018. And those are challenges that are just going to come up and get worse for Minnesota farmers this year. So there are very real tangible things that are going on here. This isn't crying wolf. There are real problems in Minnesota ag relative to federal decisions that are being made.
One of those, the USDA walked back its financial support of our farm to school program. So where does that program stand now, and what was it doing to benefit our state when it was fully funded?
That's a great program. It's a phenomenal program. No one can get mad at Farm to School. It's the best thing in the whole world. You're getting fresh produce to kids in schools, and you're paying farmers for doing that. It's a phenomenal program, and we did have a contract with the federal government for $17 million just a couple months ago that was then put on pause. And this is one of those things where we don't know if it's coming back or not. So we don't know if we need to overcompensate and put more funding in there than we have before because we have no idea what the federal government's going to do about it. And these are decisions that have to be made now. So we can't really wait for them to figure their stuff out. We have to sort of deal with it as we can. But Farm to School is an incredible program. We've been investing in it for a while. Last year, a couple years ago, we also expanded it to Farm to Food Shelf and Farm to Child Care Center. And one of the things I really wanted to do this session was expand it to vet centers and vet homes. So that we have more Minnesota healthy produce coming from our farms going to our members of our community. But unfortunately, given some of the funding uncertainty that we're getting from the federal government, we don't really have the capacity to do that as much as I think we should.
We also rely on the U.S. Department of Agriculture for our response to the bird flu. And here in Stearns County, it was been found in a dairy herd. So at the state level, absent of federal intervention, what can we do to protect our farmers, our consumers, and animals from the bird flu?
Well, we've actually done a lot already in the past couple of years, and I think it's really important that people understand that that's why your eggs cost so much. It's not because of a former president, it's because of a disease. And we can respond to that disease proactively and thoughtfully, or we can just put our heads in the sand and pretend like it's not happening. And in Minnesota, we've been very proactive about it, in that we're trying to help farmers who have issues with avian influenza, but we're also trying to prevent its spread. So one of the biggest challenges we have budgetarily in agriculture, at least, is that the USDA used to pay for testing, and now they're not. Or we're not sure if they're going to come back and start doing it, or we don't really know. So the Ag Emergency Fund at the Department of Agriculture has been drained by overcompensating for things that should have been taken care of by the USDA. So that's one real concrete challenge, because now when that new ag emergency occurs, we've spent a lot of our resources that are supposed to respond to those moments by filling in gaps that were created by the federal government. So that's one thing. But one thing that we've done also in terms of being proactive is turkey lasers. Turkey lasers are awesome. Have you ever heard of turkey lasers?
No.
They are super cool. So you know how at airports they have infrared lasers that deter pigeons from flying into your jet turbine? Well, we figured out that if you put one of those on top of a turkey barn, it scares away the waterfowl, who are the sort of patient zero when it comes to avian influenza. So that's avian influenza comes from a duck or a goose that was hanging out on your farm and got to talk to your chickens and your turkeys and got them sick. But if you can keep those ducks and those geese away from your barn, nobody gets sick. And so we created a fund where you could sort of cost share. So a farmer who had a big turkey barn, because these lasers are expensive, could pay a little bit, I think it's like half or a third of what it would cost to have these, 99.9% effective in deterring bird flu, because it keeps the ducks and the geese away from your turkeys. It's great. It's also a really cool image, because I love the idea of a turkey armed with a laser. It's not what it is, but it's still a pretty cool idea, and it's been really impactful in slowing down the spread of avian influenza.
Certainly more helpful than sharks with lasers.
Exactly, which also would be cool.
Okay. Well, federal issues aside, what other things are impacting our farmers or giving them new opportunities?
Well, the biggest challenge if you're a farmer is the weather. It's always going to be the weather. And one of the things that I admire about Minnesota's agricultural economy and population is that they're just used to dealing with uncertainty. Because past couple of years we had a horrible drought and horrible floods in alternating years. So really, when you're thinking about creating policy for agriculture, you have to prioritize dynamism and the ability to respond to uncertainty. And so that's a big concern. One of the things that farmers are asking for, environmentalists desire, and every Minnesotan wants too, is clean soil and water. So we've put lots of resources in the past into programs that enable farmers to buy equipment that lets them farm a little bit more sustainably. So that, and also trying to really build up beginning farmers and small farmers. Those are the ways that we kind of take care of our environment and our agricultural economy at the same time.
Now, Senator, your committee received good and bad news with its budget targets. So you had a reduction in funds for fiscal years 26-27, and then you got an additional allotment for the next fiscal years. What do you think was behind that decision?
Well, so we're just with the Senate here, right? That's our job, it's just the Senate. Partially it's because the children in the House made some bad decisions. So what we did in the Senate was budget responsibly. So the Senate cut $1.4 billion more than the House did. Looking at our long-term fiscal consequences, for every dollar that you cut now counts as $4 in 4 years. So the Senate took that seriously and made some hard decisions. And one of those hard decisions was to give me a negative target in agriculture, which didn't make me happy. But I understood why it was happening, and in a sense, I'm kind of glad that it did, because we've been responsible, thoughtful, and creative about how we've crafted our budget this time around in a way that we probably always should be. So that's what's behind the deficit that we got is fiscal responsibility, being an adult. The future resources are resources that are partially due to our concern with the Ag Emergency Account. As I mentioned earlier, the Ag Emergency Account is being depleted. So my main budgetary goal in agriculture this time around was to make sure that that account was taken care of.
Now, Senator, where is your committee with its omnibus bill, and what priorities is it focusing on with the funds that it does have?
We're done. So we'll be on the floor probably a week after this. We have to wait for the House bill to go through first because it's going to be a House file. But their bill, I think, is in Ways and Means, maybe even today. But ours has already been through Finance and well received. It is, I think, a very balanced bill in that we've got cuts and additions to every part of Minnesota agriculture. I think you could probably see it and say, hey, what's going on there? But what's going on there is balance and a comprehensive and inclusive look at everything that's happening in Minnesota ag. So we do put a little bit more money towards turkey lasers. We do take a little bit of money out of this grant program and put it towards something else. But it's, I think, a thoughtful and balanced way of thinking about Minnesota agriculture in the moment that we're in right now.
Now, you mentioned the Farm to Veterans program that you had wished had made it this session. What other ideas are you hoping to see come around again in the future that didn't make it into the omnibus bill this session? That's
a big part of it. I mean, to me, that's really important is to find points of overlap or points of complementarity. And so one of the first things I thought of when I was going to get this new gavel as chair of the Veterans Subcommittee was how can we find ways to leverage one in the service of the other. There also are a lot of veterans who want to be farmers. I'd like to create more programs to support that kind of work. And similarly, as I suggested earlier, I think it's important that farmers and veterans have more connections commercially, culturally, bringing food to vets' homes, talking about nutrition. People don't realize that agriculture is, 1 in 5 jobs in the state of Minnesota is agriculture related. And almost a third of the GDP of the state is agriculture related. But less than 0.25% of the state budget goes towards agriculture, which is depressing math, but is a sign that I think people don't understand how impactful agriculture is culturally to our state. And if we can make more connections between farmers and vets, and between farmers and schools, and between farmers and kids, learning nutrition, learning where their food comes from, all of that is good.
Senator, you mentioned your work on claim sharks related to veterans and turkey lasers. Is there anything else that you're most proud of that's moving forward this session?
As long as there's an animal involved that's got some sort of strange science fiction component to it, I'm all on board. So I'm not sure what the next, maybe ocelots playing cribbage. I'm not quite sure what the next kind of angle is, but right now those are 2 really important things to me. And there's a lot more good that we can do.
And can we work veterans in with those ocelots?
That's a really good question. So we did Sergeant Ocelot, who's playing cribbage.
All right, Senator, any final thoughts?
No, thanks for visiting with me. I appreciate the chance to talk.
Absolutely, it was lovely having you. What do you think about cottage foods, turkey lasers, and the Senate's other agricultural priorities this session? Where would you like to see the state's resources focus on for agriculture next session? Share your thoughts by leaving us a comment on our social media channels. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and X. All major finance and budget bills have left their committees now that the Senate's 3rd deadline has passed. If you'd like to see what made it into the committee's omnibus bills or how those priorities are being funded, it's all online. All you have to do is visit senate.mn/omnibus. These bills were completed ahead of the 3rd deadline, which was Friday, April 11th. These deadlines aim to ensure that the legislature adjourns by Monday, May 19th, and that the state's budget will be finalized by Monday, June 30th. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.